So first up, we'll I keep saying that, we'll have a quick introduction about what the Jedi Committee is by Dr. Michelle Barnes. She is a Senior Research Fellow and ARC DECRA Fellow in the People and Ecosystems Group at the Center of Excellence here at James Cook University. She leads a vigorous and highly productive research program focused on social dynamics in the context of environmental change, is currently contributing to the development of a national strategy for just adaptation in Australia, and is the co-chair of our Justice, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Committee. So without further ado, over to you, Michelle.
Thanks so much, Pat, for that introduction. It's an honor to be introducing the Jedi Committee. First off, I think I just want to answer the simple question of what is the Jedi Committee and who is it comprised of? So Jedi stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. The Jedi Committee is comprised of over 20 scientists that are affiliated with our research center, ranging across all career stages, so from students to full professors, and from a diversity of backgrounds. And it's co-chaired by myself and Dr. Georgina Gurney, who's also here today. So we, as a group, sort of from a bottom-up approach, sort of came together in late 2020 to form the committee in an attempt to address issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in our research center in terms of how the center is run and how it functions, as well as in terms of how we conduct our research. So the thought we had was our research center is a global leader in reef science. So we're already in the spotlight. So our ultimate goal was to get to a place where we can also be a leader in addressing systemic inequalities that exist in academia, including it in the workplace and in research practice. And just a really important point is that the committee is entirely volunteer-led and ran. So everyone is contributing their time on a volunteer basis to this. So our committee as a whole is made up of a diverse range of people, which I did mention previously. Today, however, you will be hearing from members of our committee who are visibly white and primarily female. So as people who identify as visibly white, we think it's pretty important to acknowledge that there are substantial privileges associated with this. At the same time, it's interesting to note that all of the people you'll be hearing from today also face some challenges associated with Jedi. For example, being largely female and all being on fixed term contracts or students. Now, secondly, and really importantly, Jedi issues are not just gender issues. So issues of Jedi relate to all sorts of differences among us based on what we experience and based on multiple elements of our identity. So things like our social, economic, and cultural backgrounds, abilities, age, sexual orientation, you name it. And this is reflected in our committee's mission, which is focused on striving to advance justice, so that's the J in Jedi, by dismantling barriers to equal opportunities and resources for all, equity, which is the E in Jedi, by ensuring that everyone has access to the same opportunities, diversity, which is the D in Jedi, by recognizing that and supporting differences among us based on what we experience and based on those elements of our identity that I kind of briefly discussed earlier, and inclusion, which is the I in Jedi, by valuing and amplifying the voices of those who experience barriers based on their identities. So it's been about a year since we all came together and formed this committee. So what have we been up to? What have we done? So the first thing that we did was develop a mission statement to guide our work in achieving our mission that I just briefly stated. So our mission statement is actually online, and I think one of my other committee members will be showing our webpage to you later, and it can be accessed there for everyone. And we've identified 4 overarching objectives in this mission. So one is focusing on Jedi issues related to how we work. So this is focused on strengthening understanding and implementation of inclusive research practices and engagement with diverse groups within the CoE, but also with our collaborators and stakeholders and in the places where we do our research. The second is focused on pipeline recruitment and retention. So this is things like enacting measures to ensure and support diversity in student and staff recruitment, including internships, as well as policies and practices that support diversity across the pipeline to casual, tenured, and senior levels. This third one is leadership, so focused on redressing imbalances in diversity and leadership positions. And the last one is focused on values, culture, image, and reputation, which is focused on ensuring Jedi is embedded in and celebrated as a part of the center's core values and culture, image, and reputation. And this includes ensuring and maintaining a feeling of inclusiveness and safety for all members of the CoE community. So in order to achieve these objectives, we've created 4 working groups, so 1 working group for each objective. And people from the committee have been volunteering their time to identify priority actions under each of these objectives. So throughout the first part of this seminar, we're going to hear from each of these working groups, and they've been really hard at work over the past year. And I just can't thank everybody enough for all of their time. It's been incredible to see the things that we've been able to achieve already. So they're going to share with us which priority action items they've identified, which of these action items that we've actually been able to achieve already, which has been great, and what challenges we still face in achieving these goals. So 3 other key developments I want to share with you before I hand the floor over. One is that the Jedi Committee now holds a member seat on the Scientific Management Committee for the center, which allows us to have a voice in how the center is run and how decisions are made, which is really great. The second is that we have conducted a very preliminary initial audit of Jedi amongst the center, but this unfortunately only captures 1 or 2 dimensions due to confidentiality issues associated with characteristics that we're able to collect data on. And so that brings me to my 3rd point, which is that we've launched a survey to try to fill some of these gaps. So I really encourage everyone to participate in that survey. You would have gotten a reminder email about it today in your inbox if you are part of the CoE community. So I strongly encourage you to please fill out that survey so that we can get a better understanding of where we're at with some of these issues, which is really difficult to get from what we have so far. But let me just show you what we do have data on, which again is very kind of simplified and preliminary, but I will show that anyway. So first off, this is some basic data on gender diversity at University of Queensland and James Cook University. And this is just to provide context. So as you can see in 2017 at UQ, we have close to gender equity among the levels A through C. So this is more early career research levels, but that drops pretty substantially once you get to those higher levels, those more senior levels at D and E. The same thing happens here at James Cook University overall, although we have much less gender diversity even at lower levels or at those earlier career stages. But that's just to say that this is more of a kind of systemic problem in academia, right? It's not just something that's happening within the center, although it is also happening here at the center, which I've shown you data on now at the bottom of the screen. So on the left, you'll see gender diversity data from 2006. So this shows you levels A through C, females and males, and then levels D through E. And you can see we had only 9% of our senior level staff at that academic staff was actually levels D and E that were female in 2006. So that's jumped to 22% in 2020, which is great, but we still have a pretty big gap there. But it is encouraging to see that we have more diversity among levels A through C. But again, we have a pretty significant pipeline problem here associated with gender. Now, turning to our leadership, here you can see a gender breakdown of our Scientific Management Committee in 2021 this year, and also our Center Advisory Board. So again, we have a pretty distinct disparity amongst the advisory board, and a little bit less so, but still present among the Scientific Management Committee. Now, in terms of students, we just show here the gender breakdown of students. This is all students that we've had since 2005 to 2021. So it's not by year. And that's the breakdown of males and females. So you see that despite the fact that we sort of have less women or females in senior level positions at the center, we've actually trained a lot of female students, more so than males. And then in terms of the breakdown, so here at the bottom right, you have where students are originally from. So this is just broken down between domestic OECD countries and non-OECD countries. So you see the large majority of students that we've had here at the center are from Australia or from OECD countries, with only 28% being from non-OECD countries. Now, again, this is very preliminary. It's only one dimension are two dimensions of diversity. And as we talked about very importantly, diversity is comprised of many other dimensions, which is why I, again, really urge you to please fill out the survey so that we can help to fill the gaps and get a better picture of what's going on here at the center. But having said that, I'm now going to hand the floor over to the next group to start discussing what actions we've been taking to try to address some of these issues. Thank you, Pat.
Great, thanks so much, Michelle. Next up, we've got Dr. Jacqueline Lau, who is going to be talking about the pipeline retention and recruitment process. So Jackie is a research fellow with the Center of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies and with World Fish, working on environmental justice and climate resilience in coastal communities. Over to you, Jackie.
Great, thanks, Pat. So the pipeline working group is a subgroup of the Jedi committee, as Michelle just mentioned, and the real focus is on diversity and inclusion across the pipeline, including recruitment and retention in the centre. And so as Michelle kind of just touched upon, there's established evidence from early high school through undergrad, high degree research and ECR up to professor and permanent position levels that in STEM and in academia more broadly, that pipeline tends to leak. And it often refers to pipeline leaking women at that higher stages, but also refers to more marginalized identities leaking out at that upper end. So it's a good metaphor for examining shifts in diversity across the pipeline, but also for understanding who is in the pipeline in the first place and how those structures might support or discourage diversity along the way. And so we took this metaphor as a useful way of trying to understand what key actions we could take for supporting and encouraging diversity across the pipeline, from the early pipeline through recruitment and retention throughout. And so as a group, we began with a big brainstorm of how to better embed Jedi values across this pipeline. And then we divided all the sort of ideas we came up with up into a list of things we could actually do as a committee and a list of things that needed more structural, higher level changes, either policy changes or actual projects to go into to make change. So our first step really was to quite simply ensure that there was a diversity statement and resources available on the centre's recruitment page. So we compiled this statement, which you can see here, and that now sits on the recruitment page alongside links to the Jedi resources at the JCU level. We also suggested that future job applications include a diversity statement as a selection criteria within them, which is becoming more and more common practice in a range of fields, including in academia. And so that's really where the applicant includes a short statement on how they support diversity inclusion in their teaching or research or engagement. And so alongside these more sort of concrete things that we were able to do fairly quickly, we came up with a whole lot of ideas that the centre could take up at higher levels, but that we as a committee probably, well, we're not in a place to do. And I want to mention Kevin here as someone who really spearheaded this work. And what this led to was the compilation of a document of key recommendations, which are really looking through a whole range of peer-reviewed research, trying to understand what actions are out there and ways to improve diversity across early pipelines, so undergrad and before that, in HDR cohorts, within retention, within recruitment, and also longer term monitoring of diversity as well. And so this document is essentially a scoping exercise and led to 14 recommendations, and I'll just touch on a few of them. So one is encourage diversity, inclusion, and unconscious bias training for anyone sitting on a CoE job search committee. Placing higher weight on alternative metrics other than publication impact, such as mentorship, inclusivity, pedagogy, and science outreach when hiring. Providing funding and support for new Indigenous education and research opportunities, and particularly in collaboration with JCU's Indigenous Education and Research Centre. And that might also include, for instance, specific scholarships and internships. Create ARC funded transition and support packages for underrepresented students, and reduce the financial barrier of training costs for lower income and underrepresented groups within the CoE. So financial support for things like dive training that are often essential for working in our fields. And so this document has currently been drafted, and we're working on next steps, which is for the Jedi committee itself to review the documents and make sure they're happy with everything. And then that will go with Michelle and Georgie to the Scientific Management Committee for them to consider these recommendations. And then beyond that, we are going to turn to more research into what sort of key performance indicators around Jedi might be useful for incorporating into the centre going forward. And that's it from the pipeline team.
Great, thanks so much, Jackie. Next up, we have Alana Gretsch, who will provide a leadership update. Alana is the Assistant Director of the Centre of Excellence and Program Leader of the Centre's Research Program 2. She's also an Associate Dean of Research Education, a member of the JCU SAGE Athena Swan Gender Equity Action and Research Team, and a JCU Equity Contact Officer. Over to you, Alana.
Thanks very much, Pat, and thanks, Jackie and Michelle, for the great start to this seminar. It's good to see you all here today. So the two main activities that the leadership group have been focused on has been training programs and a code of conduct, which I'll talk about in a moment. And so at the ARC Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies, we run a series of professional development programs. And this, in the last 12 months, we've really focused that down onto issues around Jedi. And this started in October with diversity and inclusion training, but I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. Here at JCU, we've also sponsored two showings, two film events, The Bystander Moment and Picture of Scientists, which deal with some of these issues around Jedi. The Centre has also sponsored a NAIDOC Week presentation in 2021 with Michelle Deschamps, which is fantastic. And you can see that on our YouTube page if you're interested. I highly recommend it. For students, we've also sponsored Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Cultural Competence course, which is an online course run through the Centre for Cultural Competence Australia. This course is freely accessible to many academics across Australia, but is not freely accessible to students. So we've made it accessible to our students here at the Centre. Something else that we've done is implement two Pathway to Impact workshops. The first was earlier this year with our senior staff, and the second was facilitated through our postdoctoral committee. And the reason why I include Pathway to Impact workshops and Pathway to Impact, if there is a change within this training program around Jedi issues, is because really Pathways to Impact training is about changing our research practice, right, and getting us to think a little bit differently here at the Centre. It helps us to identify our partners and users of our research, and it encourages us to generate collaborative relationships based on mutual understanding and respect, and as well as transdisciplinary research and user-focused research. So that's been really important in regards to the training portfolio they've been offering our staff and students this year. We've been working with Polycala, which is a Melbourne-based training group since October last year, to conduct diversity and inclusion training for our staff and students here at the ARC Centre. And the goal of the D&I training is to really develop a shared understanding of diversity and inclusion within our cohort, to reflect on our relationship to demographic and viewpoint diversity, to learn communication skills, to be more inclusive, and also develop competence intervening in tricky situations, which I'm sure we've all got experience with here as well and could all do some training with. And we've run 3 sessions, October last year, April and October again. And in the course of those 3 sessions, we trained 53.7 of our staff and students, which is about 28% of our entire cohort here at the Centre. In regards to who's conducted the training, if we set 28% of the benchmark, we're looking pretty good. Once again, these are not great measures of diversity at the Centre. They're just restricted to gender, to level, and to student. And so areas that we could definitely improve our male cohort of students. And we have set some benchmarks as well around leadership training in diversity and inclusion. And we've met our benchmark for the Scientific Management Committee, where all of our staff have conducted this training or equivalent training at their own institutions. And we haven't quite met our benchmark yet to have all of our level D and E staff trained using either the Polycala method or with an equivalent method that's offered through their own institutions, which certainly does happen. So So what we're doing, and unfortunately we had to postpone it this year because of COVID, is offer a 2-day adaptive leadership training for our senior staff, which has a very specific D&I training component associated with it, and we'll be implementing that in 2022 next year. And something else that we'd like to do as well is make this training, as Jackie mentioned before, or recruitment training compulsory for anyone that's on ARC Centre funded associated selection committees for new staff as well. So we've just recently released our Code of Conduct, literally this week on our website. It was given the tick by our Scientific Management Committee meeting last week. And the Code of Conduct is really to complement the codes of conducts of the 4 university nodes and the parts institutes that make up the centre, and also the Australian Code of Conduct for the responsible conduct of research as well. It applies to all ARC members, which includes our staff, CIs, PIs, affiliates, and also anyone, our students, and also anyone that's participating in centre-led symposiums, seminars and workshops, which is why Pat asked you at the beginning that by tuning to this particular event, you are agreeing to abide by our Code of Conduct. And really, why we need this is we really want to reiterate and reinforce what the values of our centre are and how we expect people to behave themselves both professionally and personally, and highlight those key attributes that we expect from our researchers and our guests here at the centre. And so, for example, we have a particular section in our Code of Conduct which talks about the fair and care principles associated with scientific and Indigenous data management and stewardship. It also reinforces our commitment to key principles of scientific research, including honesty, accountability, rigour and integrity. There's an appendix about parachute research that Pat will talk about in a moment, as well as respectful, equitable and inclusive behaviour in research practice. But really, I think the most important component of this Code of Conduct is outlining the procedures for potential breaches of the code. These procedures had already existed, have always existed, but they weren't clear to people. And that's the point of a policy, a transparent policy like this, is to make it clear to people exactly what they can do when they encounter a breach of the code or a potential breach of the code. And that means who they report it to and the potential actions that will take place if someone is found to be breaching the code. And so if you find yourself in a situation where you believe someone has breached the centre's code, our reporting structure is to our Chief Operations Officer and our Director. And together they will make a decision about it, including the decision whether or not to report it to the right University Administrative Office as well. And you can see a copy of our code here on our website. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Alana. About halfway through now. Next up, we've got Jody Thomas, who will provide an update on the values, culture, image, and reputation section of the committee. So Jody is a PhD student investigating the neurobiological mechanisms through which elevated carbon dioxide affects cephalopod behavior. She's supervised by Phil Munday and Sue Ann Watson. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Pat. So hi, I'm here on behalf of Working Group 4, which is the Values, Culture, Image and Reputation group. And our group consists of myself, Maria, Natalia, Peter and Erica has also recently joined us, which is fantastic. So as Michelle touched on before, we have 2 key focuses for our working group. So the first being that we are ensuring Jedi, or justice, equity, diversity and inclusion values are embedded within and also celebrated as part of the centre's culture and their image, values and reputation. The second part of our group, our key focus, is community and inclusion building. So really this is about maintaining and creating a feeling of inclusiveness as well as safety for all members of the CoE community. So the first task that our group has set about doing was creating a website for the Jedi committee within the CoE webpage. So this was largely done by Maria, so a massive thank you to her. You can find our webpage by going to the CoE website and then top right corner about, and then drop down the Jedi link. And that'll bring you to our wonderful webpage here. So you can see what it looks like. And this website covers our vision, mission, and objectives, which Michelle nicely covered at the start. So feel free to go there to have a bit more of a look into this. And so these were put together by all members of the Jedi Committee near the start and were agreed upon by everyone before publishing these. If you scroll down, you'll see that there's a contact form. So this is where you can get in contact with the entire Jedi Committee as the best way if you have maybe any suggestions or questions or would like to join us. And it also shows all the members within the Jedi Committee. So a big thank you to everyone who's part of this committee. So continuing on from here, we're currently working on developing a resources page. So this will be put up within the Jedi Committee webpage on the CoE website. And this is really part of our first key aim of ensuring the Jedi values are embedded within the centre. Really, the aim of this is to create a compilation of resources that are easily accessible to the CoE members, making it a lot easier for all of you to be involved in and keep up to date with Jedi values and issues. So as part of this, we're going to provide a compilation of links to academic organisations that are Jedi related. So for example, Black and Marine Science or academically, chronically academic. So this will be a great way that you can have an easy way to look through, and maybe if you identify with a few of these organisations, it'll be a nice way to find a community that can help you with these areas. We'll also be creating links to freely available online training courses. So hopefully you can take your time to do some of these, also to keep up with Jedi values and Jedi issues. Moving forward from this, we're also working towards providing ongoing training for all Jedi Committee members, because obviously it's really important that if we're part of this committee, that we keep up to date with all these Jedi related issues. Moving on to our second key focus, which is this community and inclusion building. We're currently developing ideas for how to bring this about in the CoE Centre. We have two main action items that we're going to focus on first. The first one is developing a Jedi social media page. So the aim of this is to create an area where we can share Jedi related social events. And the second main action item is going to be a welcome packet for all new staff and students starting at the centre. So that's it from me for this group. Thank you very much, and back to you, Pat.
Great, thanks so much, Jody. Next up, we've got Jenny Donaldson, who will be talking about the working group we've got called How We Work. So Jenny is currently an ARC Future Fellow at JCU, and her research focuses on the ability of coral reef fish to acclimate and adapt to environmental change. Over to you, Jenny.
Thanks very much, Pat. So I'm representing today the How We Work group, which was group 1. And I just want to make sure that everybody knew who else was in the group. So I pictured everyone at the bottom: Greg, Jorge, John, Christina, and Patrick. And our main goal was to strengthen understanding and implementation of inclusive and just research practices within the CoE and in the places where we do our research. And something that came about very clearly as we started to discuss these things is that, of course, our group is very interconnected to all the other groups, and a lot of the things we are thinking are really critical are also things that you've heard the others before me talk about. So some of the main actions or topics that we wanted to focus on as being really important in terms of how we work was how we work includes everything. It includes how we work when we go and do our research in the field or in the communities that we do research. It's how we work in the office. It's how we work online. So straight away, that got us thinking how big of a topic this is, and how there's lots of different things that might be quite important in terms of this space. So one of the things we definitely have been working on and talking a lot about is what are the practices that the centre and those of us in the centre can do to gain better Jedi in any of these circumstances. So whether it's when we go and do field research or just every day in the office. One of the topics that came up that became a real focus, and Patrick's and Georgia are going to talk about it in a little bit, is parachute science, and whether there are any concerns with the way in which we do research, or just other ways that we can improve. We've definitely been talking a lot about pathway to impact lately, because funders care more about this, but also because the point of doing the research is to have impact. But what we consider impact, and maybe what the communities that we work with or work in consider impact, may not be the same. And I guess gaining a better understanding of that would really help us do a better job of Jedi practices. The other thing that we've talked about a lot and is key performance indicators. So do the things that we monitor and follow actually capture Jedi very well, or practices that promote Jedi? So that's come up a lot from earlier discussions with Alana and Michelle, that we and others, that we don't actually have really great data sometimes to understand how well a job we're even doing. And there's definitely some places that we can improve in terms of having better key performance indicators that might better showcase when we are doing good practices that aren't actually being captured at the moment. The longer term goal is to develop a document on Jedi practices and best practices, something that's accessible to everyone to have a read and think about maybe how they could implement some of these good or better practices into their research and into how they work. But that's quite a big goal. So we haven't quite finished that one yet. And then the other thing we've been working on this year is a guiding document for inclusive events. And so the two that are highlighted in pink have what we've more come closer or have actually achieved. But this will be coming out soon, and just outline some ideas of when we do begin to think about having a symposium or having a conference. What are some of the things we can do, being a part of the organizing committee or being a volunteer, that might actually create better inclusion and diversity? And so with that, I'll hand over to the next speaker.
Great, thanks so much, Jenny. So thanks everyone. Those were the representatives from our 4 working groups providing updates. Next up, we'll just have a quick discussion on some of the outputs around parachute research and how we work. So first, we've got Georgina Gurney, who's an ARC DECRA Fellow and a Senior Research Fellow in Environmental Social Science at the Centre of Excellence in Townsville. And she'll be talking about a recent paper that just came out examining gender and geographic representation in coral reef science. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Pat. So today I'll be talking about some research that I was involved in that really highlights some of the diversity issues in coral reef science that the Jedi Committee and in particular the How We Work group is trying to address. And so this research examined gender and geographic representation in coral reef science publications over 15 years or so, and was co-authored by this excellent group of co-authors here, and was led by Gabby Abadia from the World Wildlife Fund and Samantha Cheng from the American Museum of Natural History. And so very briefly, what we were trying to do there was we did a literature review to try to identify some of the trends in gender and geographic representation in coral reef publications. And our literature review involved examining work from 10 top journals that were with the work published from 2003 to 2018. And that identified 1,677 articles. And from those articles, we recorded a lot of information, including the gender, as far as we could tell, up to an extent of all the authors, the country in which their affiliated organisation was located in, and where the research was actually being undertaken. And we categorised those countries into whether they were OECD or non-OECD, and a quick reminder there of which countries are OECD countries. And so obviously you can see that the OECD countries in blue tend to be high income countries, or global north countries also. And it's worth thinking about the location of coral reefs versus the location of OECD countries here. So very briefly, what we found was that there was a very high proportion of the coral reef research that we reviewed was authored by people that were affiliated with organisations in OECD countries. So that's the blue component of the bars you can see there. And so if you look at the top row here, it's just the overall authorship trends. We can see that the vast majority is obviously authored by people from OECD countries. And in 2018, that represented actually 88% of the authors. But if you look over time from 2003 to 2018, we can see that the proportion of authors from OECD and non-OECD countries is becoming a little bit more balanced, but hasn't changed a lot. And then if you take a look at the second row and the third row there, which is the second row is for the affiliation of the first authors, and the third row for the affiliation of the last authors, you can see some pretty similar trends. And then if we take a bit of a look at where the research was being undertaken, you can see here on the left is a graph for research that was undertaken in OECD countries, and on the right, research that was undertaken in non-OECD countries. And the dark blue part of the bar represents where the author was based at an affiliation in the country in which the research was undertaken. So if we look at the left, we can see that the vast majority of research that is undertaken in OECD countries is undertaken by authors that are actually based in institutions in those countries. And we see exactly the opposite trends in the graph on the right, which is research undertaken in non-OECD countries, where we can see the vast majority of research is undertaken by researchers that are not based in the country in which the research was undertaken. So that's that light blue component of the bar there. And if we take it a little bit further and sort of look at the actual countries, we classify the countries according to World Bank classification system, but we pulled out Australia and the US because they account for around 50%, authorship accounts for around 50% of the publications that we examined. And what you can see is the location of the author affiliated organisation on the left, and on the right part of this skanky graph is where the research was actually undertaken. So if we look at Australia, we can see, the trends that we saw in the previous graph, that yes, a lot of the research that we undertake is undertaken in Australia, as we would expect, but a lot of the research is also undertaken in East Asia and the Pacific region, and likewise with the US, OECD country, we're seeing a lot of research is undertaken in Latin America and the Caribbean, many of those countries of which are non-OECD, as well as the Asia Pacific, East Asia and the Pacific. And just moving on to gender representation. Here we can see overall trends on the top, with the female authors in green and the male authors in purple. And if we look at overall authorship, we can see an encouraging trend of increasing gender balance from 2003 to 2018, where in 2003 we had 18% of authorship was contributed by female authors, and in 2018 that rose to 33%. And we can see that there are similar trends for first authorship. So the gender identity of the first author, where we're having increasing percentage of female first authors. And of course, if you take a look at the last row there, which is the gender of the last authors, we see that the percentage of female last authors is quite low, as we'd expect, and obviously that is something. If you looked at the gender of first authors versus the gender of last authors, we can see a much higher proportion of female first authors than last authors, and obviously that is symptomatic of the gender inequalities that we're seeing in universities and other institutions in terms of gender breakdown of people in higher positions. So I did have time to talk about the drivers and the recommendations that we gave to address these diversity issues in coral reef science, but I will pass on to Pat, who will talk about one way that we as researchers can start addressing these geographic diversity issues in coral reef science. And so Pat is a postdoctoral fellow here at the centre and with World Fish. He's a joint postdoctoral fellow, and his research examines resilience of coral reef fisheries. Over to you, Pat.
Sorry, I'm having trouble unsharing my muting my microphone. 1 moment. There we go. Thanks, Georgie. So I just a quick note. I just shared a document in the chat function, which is a copy of this, and I just want to spend a few minutes building off the work Georgie and her colleagues have done, but with more of a practical focus on what steps we can take as individuals to improve our practice. And I'll share a few examples of things I'm currently working on in this regard imperfectly. So first, we've now completed a 2-page document on this concept of parachute research and what it is, how we can go about avoiding it, and how do we engage in sort of genuine co-production of knowledge. And this is largely what Georgie just touched on. So parachute science is a practice whereby international scientists, typically from higher income countries, as we've seen, conduct field studies in other countries, typically lower income countries, and then complete the research in their home country without any further effective communication or engagement with the host nation. And I think there's enough information here on what this is and why we want to avoid it, but I think it's important to reflect for a moment on whether this is something any of us, including myself, have been somewhat guilty of. I think all of us would benefit from taking a moment to reflect on how our personal research practices could be done better. And in some ways, this is the Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies. And I think it's pretty safe to say that all coral reef systems that we're working on are either those in foreign countries, mainly low and middle income countries, or here in Australia, where there are traditional owners. So what this means is that regardless of where we're working, these concepts are really relevant to all of us, I think. And I also want to note, this isn't a process that's black and white with clear right and wrong answers. I think largely instead it's one of degrees and exists along a spectrum that might be more or less applicable based on the specific situations. So how can we do better? Obviously, this is very context dependent. On this 2-page document, we've put a statement at the bottom it's a quote from the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies that sums it up quite well. So what they have to say about engaging ethically is that this is a yin yamara. So we're a jury concept, which means to act with honor and respect, with wisdom, to go slowly and act responsibly, be gentle and polite and honest with each other, and be careful of the words and actions we put out to the world, because we need to understand the impact that they can have. So as I said, this means there isn't always one correct way to act, but if we follow that ethos, then I think likely all of us will be doing far better than if we don't. The second page of this document is a list of 12 specific tips on how we can work, how we can improve our work. And rather than going through them all, which if you're interested, you can do in your own time, I'll just touch on a few. The first thing I think to think about is this concept of co-authorship and adding co-authors from, say, host nations where we're working to academic publications. And this is very important, how we decide who goes on papers. some journals, such as Conservation Letters, are now mandating that at least one individual from a host nation must be included as a co-author. But it's a bit of a complex process to navigate, right? So what constitutes authorship? Some people might be integral to the work happening, but they can't read or write or understand complex analyses, in which case their input on final manuscript preparation really isn't that feasible or helpful. But again, why should that last 10% of the process be deemed the only part of importance? And I think it's also worth pointing out that offering co-authorship on publications can still fall into that trap of colonial science. So we say this is something worthwhile to offer, but for many, there's really no interest in academic authorship. This isn't a metric by which they gauge success. So instead, we could be focusing on identifying what's important for the groups we're working with. What do they need? What would they benefit from? And how can we help with their priorities instead of offering them our priorities? And I've personally experienced this conflicting issue where you end up trying to get people involved in writing a paper because it's the right thing to do, but they also aren't really that interested or they've got other priorities. So I thought I'd just wrap up with a quick example to transition us into the Q&A of how I'm personally navigating this process very imperfectly. And hopefully this can generate a bit of a discussion for how we can all improve our practices. So for me, I completed my PhD in Tonga in collaboration with the Ministry of Fisheries there. And when I first approached them about doing the research, they were quite hesitant at first and quite standoffish. And it took me a while to realize that there was a conflict in how we were perceiving the interaction. So me, on my high horse, assumed that doing research on Tonga's coral reefs and publishing it with them as co-authors meant that I was giving them something and providing them a service. But they viewed it actually as me taking something. So they viewed it as me taking knowledge of their systems without providing anything of value in return. And it took me a while to realize this. And one of the things I've since tried to do was to really build the research around what they were asking for. So tailoring the research to fit their priorities. And it often really doesn't take that much effort to find something that will be novel research in your field, but still helpful. And I've also really tried to add other outputs besides publications. So one of the main outputs from my PhD was a national report that was translated into Tongan and written for the public. And the Ministry of Fisheries has now expressed far more enthusiasm about this than they ever have for any papers. And then even this morning, I'm still currently facing this dilemma for how to deal with these sorts of things and manage this process. So any feedback would be great. We've got a paper now with Renato that is ready to submit, and we've contacted the Tongan Ministry now 4 or 5 times, asking for their approval and inviting them to be authors and provide feedback, which we're just not getting. So if we go ahead and submit it, then it's not technically the right thing to do, but it's also not really the right thing to do to drop them as collaborators, because this is something they've specifically asked for when we started the research. So there's really all these questions are constantly coming up, and I think all of us are trying to navigate them continuously, and there isn't necessarily a right answer. But if we act in this sort of ethic and framework, then I think we could be doing much, much better. So with that, I'll wrap up. Sorry, my computer's freezing again. With that, I'll wrap up the first part of the seminar and open it up to a bit of discussion, I guess. So thanks so much, everyone, for all the wonderful words and everyone's patience. I'll just start by saying again what I did at the start. We're really hoping to achieve sort of forward-looking and action-oriented conversations here. And I know it can be hard to talk about diversity issues because it can be intimidating that we might say the wrong thing. But I want to reiterate again that this is a safe space. So I'll back off for now, but start by asking if anyone else would like to provide some examples of problems or thoughts or points they'd like to make about encountering, say, parachute research or improving this practice, and then we can move on to some of the other topics we've been discussing. So with that, anyone can jump in.
Hey everyone. Oh,
go ahead, Michelle.
I'm sorry, Josh. I'll jump in because I've got to run away to another meeting. Oh, hang on, I'll move you. Working from home, just realised I didn't brush my hair. Thanks so much, guys. I just really applaud the work that you are doing. Like, just it's really well done, and I really applaud your bravery in turning this lens upon your centre and yourselves, and I think it's just awesome. So well done to all of you. And in the spirit of, I think, the integrity with which you've presented this work, I'm going to ask just one little pointy question. It was in Alana's presentation. I saw a graph showing the number of participants in your inclusivity training, and I just felt like the last graph that really showed the higher levels of your, what is it, D to whatever that level is, but the highest, levels of your staff there. There was such a disproportion between the women who were anyway a smaller percentage, much smaller percentage of the higher appointments, 83% they had attended, and then there was like a third of the men, which were overwhelmingly the higher appointments. So just really not as like an arrow or anything at all like that, just in the spirit of like openness and integrity. I just thought, wow, that's quite stark. And if you had any thoughts about that, given that we know a lot of the decision making is coming from that area.
Thanks, Michelle. I was a little bit shocked too when I ran the data. I think there's a couple of things going on there. It's a well-known fact that at universities, women wear the burden of service, and as reflected here in the diversity of people presenting to you today. And I think that is also reflected in the results you're speaking of as well, that women at higher levels take on service associated with Jedi issues because they are somewhat affected by them relative to our male colleagues at those levels. I think there's something also going on here, especially with the results of the blood group review at JCU and at other universities, is that lots of additional training, compulsory training, is now provided by institutions to their academic staff members. And so some of those people in that particular level have conducted equivalent, what I would call equivalent training in their own institutions. And so haven't needed to do the D&I training that we've run here through the centre. So I think that that is also reflected in those results as well. But yes, good observation. What I was particularly, what I think actually the area that we particularly need to work on though is better engagement of our male cohort of PhD, honours and master students, where there was only a 5% take-up rate of the course.
Yeah, thanks, Alana. I think that group, as well as the senior males, because although you offered two potential explanations, I don't see why the second one wouldn't equally relate to females and males. And so you have a really stark difference between the, females and males in terms of taking the training, and that explanation should have applied to both of them.
Yes, I agree with you.
Josh, did you have something to say earlier?
Yeah, it was on a very different topic. It seems like the conversation's moved on. I was just going to talk a little bit about the parachute science, if we want to bring it back to that. I think I think it was important, Patrick, your discussion a little bit about the nuances of it, and that it's not always necessarily clear cut, including people as co-authors. I might just give an example right now with a paper I'm working on where my colleagues in a specific NGO in Indonesia are not allowed to become involved in the paper. They are not allowed as an institution to do it because they're currently undergoing a MOU with the government. So I'm trying very hard to engage them and they're not allowed to. So simply saying, well, there's a paper with data from Indonesia and no one from Indonesia there now, that actually is kind of misleading about the process and their engagement in the whole process, but they're just not allowed to be involved in that now. Should we never write the paper because they're not involved? I don't necessarily think so. So I'm worried about well-meaning concepts like conservation letters saying you have to have somebody from a host country involved in it, because that doesn't, it's a great intention and you should intend to have people involved, but sometimes there's nuances that actually don't permit that. And I think it doesn't really, the intention to include people doesn't do that. And what I think it's more likely to do is encourage perverse incentives like gift authorship, where people that haven't really done anything get tacked on, and that doesn't necessarily help things either. So I guess, just backing off that, I appreciate that it's a nuanced issue and that it's complicated and it's not just straightforward. And I think some of the metrics that you might use to measure it are surprisingly problematic.
Yeah, I'd actually like to open that up to others to comment on. We've discussed that in Jedi a little bit about perverse incentives and how we could go about realigning those at sort of a more structural and institutional level, because that's something that leads a lot of this.
Mm-hmm.
Just a note on, so doing that training at the start of the year, the inclusion, I seriously, from the title, I was not expecting what the training is and how interesting it would be. It's almost like if we could rebrand the name or explain that it's not just having another training. And to me it was extremely interesting, and especially the psychology behind what does it mean, inclusion. And so I just wanted to mention that, like saying maybe the title has scared some people, and maybe making it that you have to do it is a good way. That's it.
Thanks, Sue. Pat, I just wanted to, it's related to all of this, I guess, in terms of inclusion and how to include people, as you were mentioning, Pat, in the way that means something to them, and in terms of this authorship and, potential gift authorship and that sort of thing. Could we instead, we as, not necessarily the centre, but just collectively as scientists, journals, could it be something more like, instead of the example with conservation letters, you need to include someone from the host country? Could it be, have you developed, whether it's a document or a presentation or something, like some sort of showing that you've developed something with the host nation that means something to them, like, not that they're on a paper that means something to us, but have we done something, and can we have something to show that we've not just engaged, but I guess shared knowledge on a level that means something to the host nation. I'm not sure.
I think that's a really good point, Eva, and it needs to, when we try to address diversity issues in coral reef science and coral reef publications, it's not just a case of authorship as well. Obviously, addressing parachute science has to be, which is more important actually, about building the capacity and empowering those people in other countries, local scientists, NGOs, or whoever you're working with. And I think I agree with you, Josh, that it's definitely and Pat, it's not a clear-cut issue at all in publications and publication mandates and things with journals, and it can lead to, and it definitely could lead to gift authorship. But at the same time, hopefully by having these kinds of, and it will be interesting to see how conservation letters actually, plays this out. Is it hard and fast rule, or is it just sort of some guiding kind of principles? But maybe at least by having that as a guideline on their website, it might encourage people to start thinking about those issues and how they should go about engaging with colleagues from the countries in which they work. And it's not just about having them on a paper, but as Eva said, about, engaging and providing and meeting their needs and empowering them to do science without outside researchers like us.
Georgie, a nice, maybe a sort of middle ground there is current biology now has a diversity and inclusion statement that you have to fill out that actually gets published on there, and they actually ask you about things like that. And have you done that? And that may serve better than outright mandates in situations like that. If no one else is talking, is it okay if I ask a question? I think you guys are doing really, really important work, and I love seeing it all. The center's closing in 12 months from now. We'll have our last, 12 months from now, we'll have the last one we ever do, our last seminar. How can the important work that you guys are doing be institutionalized into JCU more broadly? I'd hate to see it all kind of shutter up when our center shutters.
Well, one of the ways that I think it kind of links to the previous conversation as well is it sounds like we're having a big conversation about the fact that journal articles have been held as such a strong metric, but have real limitations. And so maybe this comes back to this idea of different KPIs. So different KPIs that better showcase co-production and diversity and inclusion. And that I think is something that we could easily, or could hopefully lead wherever we end up. So even if some of us don't stay at JCU, I feel like if we as a team brainstorm and have some good ideas for what the alternative metrics are, what the alternative metrics could be, or what are the, what's another way that you could show those things, that might be something that universities would uptake because they love KPIs, right?
Great point, Jenny. Also, another thing too is that I feel like we're doing a lot of work within the center, but we're also creating a culture of change. And I think, just the committee itself is comprised of over 20 individuals, and all of these individuals will end up somewhere. And all of them will be, very familiar with Jedi issues and how they can be addressed. And I feel like the strides and steps that we're taking here are going to echo throughout, all the halls of the great institutions that we all end up in. And so I think it's also creating a bit of a legacy.
And maybe even in the societies that we partake in. So like the aspects of the, creating a diverse and inclusive conference that our group was tasked with. I decided to join AMSA's conference organizing committee, and straight away was like, oh, we haven't had a conversation about how we might integrate diversity and inclusion better. So I feel like, yeah, there's some great opportunities just as we all go off into the world by having those open conversations that people will then have the open conversations with other people, and it kind of like spreads.
Great, thanks, Jenny. Sorry, Jorge, he's had his hand up for a while. I might just butt in to let him ask his question.
That's all right, but no, it's all very interesting, so I wasn't too much in a rush. I was just going to follow up now I've got a bit of a collection of ideas, but I want to just follow up on the parachute science and some of the comments by Josh and Jenny now. And I think that, yes, certainly there's no one single way to do things properly, although if, as you say, we follow generally the spirit of that ethos of how we do our research, as really amazingly worded by IATSEs. That's a very good start. And just to be a bit more blunt, I think that the example that Josh gave about consulators, I think that they just completely missed the point. I mean, I just it's just completely wrong. I think that yes, it's more about how they conducted the research, how they designed the research in the first place, and what were the goals of the research. And we know, as you already said, Pat, that the currency that many of the people that we work with when they're not scientists is not papers. I mean, they couldn't care less about being paper. I mean, it's important to have them as co-authors sometimes because it's an acknowledgement of their important or critical contribution in different ways. And so in some cases, it might be okay to have, I guess, as co-authors, if they want to. That obviously means that they may contribute in different ways to our typical standards of have they written something, have they done some analysis, have they provided funding, have they blah, blah, blah. So we need to rethink how we actually acknowledge and provide co-authorship, I guess. But more important than that, I think it's how to really give back to the people we work with, to the things they want. And sometimes it's creating specific products, sometimes it's doing capacity building, sometimes it's just reporting back, and sometimes it's being available after the research to continue providing support. And there's not a single way of how we can do these things better, but I think that it's a great start, and I'm really happy to see how much the committee has advanced from the beginning of the conversations, and I think it's looking really good, and yeah, there's a lot to work with. Even just the veneer of the problem, which is just looking at the geographic and gender representation, underlying that there's a bigger problem probably in other forms of diversity and inclusion, but it's a great start, and I think that's the main thing, and I'm really happy to see it's looking really good.
I think another point there that's worth bringing up as well, if any of you would hear for Libby and Bob's talk last week, and how AIMS is now mandating a policy that they have to get traditional owner approval for research that happens on reefs in Australia. And if they say no, that means no. I think that's something maybe we could start thinking about. I don't know if that's something we could do at the center or what that sort of process is, but I'd be interested to hear other people's thoughts on what that means and how we could proceed with things like that.
I think in that particular scenario, it shows that we need more system level support as researchers to engage with communities, traditional owner communities, particularly in Australia. And that means having the right kind of support for those communities to take on the level of engagement that government is now expecting of them. This is a governance issue, it's a funding issue, it's a capacity issue. I don't necessarily think it's something that can be solved by the behaviour of individual researchers. It's a system level problem that needs fixing.
Absolutely. The other question that came up earlier that we discussed prior to this talk is how we'd like to hear how helpful people think the training has been and that Jedi has been offering, if there's other training that they think could be useful, or also if there's actually too much training and it's just a bit overwhelming. So if anyone's got any thoughts or comments on that, it would be great to hear them.
I don't think it's too much training, Pat. I actually attended twice. I found interesting things in both. So if anyone thinks that they don't have enough time to attend these things, I think they should just probably rethink whether it's actually quite interesting.
Great. Okay. Well, look, on that note, I think we're starting to wrap up. I just wanted to say thanks again, everyone on the committee and everyone at the centre as well. It's been a great year. It's been actually a lot of fun organising these seminars as well, and I think we are making progress at the centre on these topics. So I think that's really positive. I do need to put in one final plug for the survey. So for those of you who haven't completed the survey, please do so. It will be very helpful for all of us. And as I said earlier, that parachute research document will be available. I think we might try and send it out or make it available with the Code of Conduct on the website.
It is. It's appendix in the Code of Conduct on the website.
Great. So yeah, if there's anything else anyone would like to say, chime in, and if not, thanks again, and I guess we'll see you all in the new year.